Hello and welcome to Any Questions. Today we're the guests of Marden High School in Cullercoats, Tyne and Wear. Cullercoats lies on the coast. In the 19th century, the views from what was then a fishing village attracted artists to live and work here. These days, rather appropriately, Marden High describes itself as a school specialising in media arts, science and maths. Well, let me introduce you to our media-ready guests on Any Questions. Rishnara Ali is the Labour MP for Bethnal Green and Bow. She's thrown her hat into the crowded contest for the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. In the last Parliament, she served as Shadow Minister for International Development and then Shadow Education Minister. In September 2014, she resigned from the Labour front bench to abstain on a House of Commons motion permitting military action in Iraq. David Davis is the Conservative MP for Halton Price and Howden. A former Europe minister and a key figure on the right of his party, he's often described as a big beast at the backbenches. He's a champion of civil liberties and often speaks on issues such as security, intelligence gathering and policing. In June 2008, when he was Shadow Home Secretary, he dramatically stood down as an MP, forcing a by-election in protest against what he called the slow strangulation of fundamental British freedoms. Peter Hennessy is Attlee Professor of Contemporary History at Queen Mary, University of London. A constitutional expert and a crossbench peer, in his latest book, The Kingdom to Come, he records the run-up to the Scottish independence referendum last September and describes what he calls the enormous constitutional building site, which has opened up for the whole of the United Kingdom by the result. Tommy Shepherd is part of Team 56. The new MP for Edinburgh East is one of the 56 Scottish National Party politicians at the Palace of Westminster. Once an active member of the Labour Party, he said that the party left him rather than the other way around. He was also the man behind the Stand Comedy Club chain, and he was a Scottish area finalist in TV's MasterChef in 1996. Comedy, cooking and politics, that's quite a combination. Serious dinner parties at your house. Welcome to all of our panellists this evening. So, could we have our first question, please?
My name is Jean McLean. When politicians refer to the Northern Powerhouse, the emphasis is on Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield. Is Newcastle being sidelined? Perhaps we would be more appreciated here in the North East if we became more closely associated with Scotland.
David Davis, the Northern Powerhouse. How inclusive is it really?
Well, actually, a local politician here said it sounded rather like a northern nightclub. But it's intrinsically a good idea, but there are risks, and you really rather highlight one of them. The idea, of course, is to try to galvanise the cities of the north to grow as fast and as successfully as London has, because London has a hugely beneficial economic advantage at the moment. The problem with it, and I think you touch on it, is, of course, if you're not in one of the northern powerhouses, do things get sucked away from you? My nearest city is Hull. And so if Leeds or Bradford or one of the West Yorkshire cities become the Northern Powerhouse for their part, then we may get things sucked away from us. But in principle, it's a good idea. The idea of actually giving power and money and resources to the people in the North to actually govern their own lives and build the economy.
But is the time right for it now? After all, some of these places, Newcastle was one of them, that actually rejected the option of an elected mayor, although where we are right now, North Tyneside already has an elected mayor.
Yeah, and they rejected the North East rejected Northern devolution completely at one point. Indeed, I was one of those arguing for that rejection. But I think that was because we were talking about a sort of a rather large bureaucracy being built, and we didn't like the idea of the bureaucracy. But I think the idea of the mayors, of the mayoralty, is to have minimum bureaucracy but maximum power. That's the idea.
Tommy Shepherd, do you think the North East could join up with Scotland in some way?
Well, I would say if you're worried about being left behind, so are we. We would very much be in favour of anything that would rebalance the economy and power in the UK away from the city-state of London, and I think anything that does that is to be welcomed. I welcome the City Deal project, for example, and I think there's a potential to expand that to many of the great cities in the United Kingdom. But I think you have to always be suspicious at the back of your mind that there may just be some gimmicks being played here, and some of this may be political window dressing rather than anything of substance. And I think that might be the case with the Metro Mayor concept, for example. And I would say the lesson from Scotland is that rather than have these measures brought down from above and it be a top-down sort of reform, you really need to try and build an awareness amongst people on the ground and let them say what type of government they want and what type of powers they want. If you do that, it's going to be a much more lasting settlement in the end.
Rushnara Ali, you're a London MP. What do you think could be learnt by a Northern Powerhouse from the success of London? Are there lessons that can be transferred?
Well, I think it's really important that we do devolve power, and that has to be done in a genuine way so that different regions can absorb and attract the talent they have in business, in culture, in the arts, in education, all of that, all the talent that exists, and build an economy that is appropriate for that region. This region has had £650 million worth of cuts, much more than other parts of the country. What we need to do is make sure that each region has a strong voice as a counterbalance to the power of Whitehall and Westminster. So it needs to be genuine, and we do need to devolve power in a meaningful way. And I feel that that hasn't happened in the past, despite some attempts by my party in the past to devolve power. Let's not forget that Whitehall often finds it difficult also to give power away, along with government ministers.
Peter Hennessy, Whitehall often finds it hard to give power away. And also coming back to this question, is the time right for this? After all, there are long-standing rivalries. Newcastle, Sunderland, Manchester, Liverpool.
One of the problems is that we have a tendency, we Brits, to look at things in fragments rather than as systems. And the Scottish question has meant that we've had to confront a whole range of things way beyond, Tommy, your own patch, quite rightly on the back of the referendum and the possibility of another referendum. But what we really need is to think carefully about the difference between devolution, which you have to Scotland and Wales, and decentralisation both within Wales and Scotland, and decentralisation within England. And we need, I think, at the Constitutional Convention, the pace of change in Scotland has got to be recognised, and the Scottish legislation is ready to go, though I think Tommy wants a slightly different version of it, I suspect. And that is the pacemaker. But before we start fragmenting the UK in a different way within England, say, we need to have a systems think. We need a constitutional convention drawing on all the nations and regions to think about how this might work. Because city magnets work in some parts of the country, as David was saying, but not all. And also the emotional attachments that people have are very important. It's Edmund Burke's notion of little platoons. For some people, it's counties. It's the medieval solution to this question, and we love counties because they have cathedrals and cricket teams. A great emotional attachment. In the northeast, you have an intense attachment, I know, to your area. But we really need to pause and think what we're doing, because if we fragment our country and turn it into a Gilbert and Sullivan thing of shreds and patches, we'll rue the day. One of my old friends used to be Cabinet Secretary, Richard Wilson, and he said to my students once at Queen Mary, we go into our big constitutional changes as if under anaesthetic, and we wake up a few years later and said, did we really mean it to be like this? So we need to be careful and we need to think.
Just to say quickly, we've had a lot of questions on this, so it suggests there is an interest in the idea. David
and with good reason. I mean, look, one of the things about Britain is it's always talked about as very centralised, but it's not just political centralisation, it's massive economic centralisation. You look at Germany, there are 8 cities with more economic activity than Berlin and more capital investment by every measure. We are not like that at all. There's nobody that competes with London at the moment in those terms. The result being London has a hugely successful economy when the rest of the country is in depression. So that's why this is urgent. It's important to get it right, but it's important to get on with it.
Exactly. London is a city-state, and it could easily float away. I can't bear the thought of any part of the United Kingdom fragmenting. I'm a unionist to my last fibre, Tommy. But London is a city-state and could behave as a city-state, which would be to all our disadvantages. And of course, I feel this very acutely because of my age. Some of you in the audience will do too, because we grew up in the shadow of the Second World War when we'd gone through this great collective enterprise as Brits. We thought as Brits. We didn't think in fragments in the way that's happening now, and I do regret that. And I do hope we can find things to fall in about rather than to fall out over. And that includes keeping the United Kingdom in being.
Tommy Shepherd.
Yeah, I mean, London is a city-state, and we need to take some action to try and rebalance power, excuse me, inside the United Kingdom, which is why, on a related matter to the Northern Powerhouse, the HS2, which is quite important to get the infrastructure right as well, one of the things that annoys me somewhat is that the proposal is that we should sort of build that gradually coming out from London and inch up the country just to see how far we get and hold out the possibility. It might go to Manchester, it might even go to Scotland. I'd say, why don't we look at this the other way around? If it's a UK infrastructure project, why don't we do what we did with the Channel Tunnel and start building from both ends at once and meet in the middle? And that would be a statement that actually says we can get it done for the good of the UK.
David Davis, can you imagine any support for that?
No, I wouldn't build it at all, I'm afraid. Yeah. Whatever it is, 50 billion quid, it's going to take 30 years and it's going to save next to nothing. I mean, we could spend that money, Tommy, improving every bottleneck in the system from London to Edinburgh and points north and get faster responses and better value for money. That's the truth of the matter.
Tommy Shepherd?
Well, we could, but I do think we need dramatic improvement in our rail infrastructure for the second half of the 21st century. And because of the long lead-in time, you have to start making these decisions now. The great worry is that this is a decision that might be seen as just how can London benefit from getting more people into London, rather than actually work things out for the UK as a whole.
I'm being selfish because I'm older than you. I want it in the first half of the 21st century.
Rishnara Ali, before we move on, as a London MP, do you feel rather responsible then for the rest of the country, actually feeling rather overshadowed?
Well, look, I think we need to make sure every city, every region is able to be strategic about its economic future. And one of the reasons why we desperately needed London to have a London government is so that we could work together. And I think there's a strong case for having competition, but also, as Peter has said, more that brings us together. And I think it will be healthy for us if we can make sure that each region has different identities, but we come together and we help our people thrive by ensuring that they have the opportunities in their own region, as well as being able to work together across the country. That's the kind of country I want to live in. And I don't want people to feel resentful about London. I want us to feel that we are absolutely, they do at the moment, and we need to rebalance. I totally agree. We need to rebalance the economy, but that requires governments to pass resources and powers to places all over the country. And I think that we should be able to share some of the lessons, but also some of the failures as well in London, in the devolution that's happened in London.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on. Our next question, please.
Fiona Henderson. With the confirmation today that Charles Kennedy's tragic death was linked to his alcohol problem, what thoughts does the panel have about the nation's drinking habits?
Peter Hennessy, I think you knew Charlie Kennedy quite well.
Well, I didn't know him that well, but I thought the world of him, actually. He was a life enhancer. He had a wonderful way with words. He was witty. And he never fell into the banalities, the smelly little orthodoxies, as George Orwell called them, of political life. And neither my two friends here tonight, three friends are political friends, but he never went for the usual suspect remarks and the prefabricated, here's a phrase I made earlier. And he's greatly missed. He's irreplaceable. And it is an absolute tragedy that it should have ended like this for him. But the wider question of alcoholism in our society is it's very difficult in an open society to know where the line is in terms of the state saying thou shalt not and thou shalt. I mean, the purpose of open societies is you maximise freedom within them, and that includes the freedom to consume what you want pretty well, unless it's a banned drug. And alcohol has always provided this problem. And in the 19th century, there were temperance movements. I can remember as a young boy going to Monmouth, which wasn't then part of Wales, but it was dry on Sundays. My Auntie Molly kept a pub in Newport because they had plebiscites. And the temperance movement was very strong. So it's an old problem, but it's become particularly acute in the last 20 years. And I'm not very good with the relative statistics, but I think the problem of alcohol as outstripping the problem of drugs, some people say, in terms of its harmful effects. But where you draw the line and what the state should and shouldn't do, I think there should be a minimum price for alcohol. That's where I would draw the line. But it's very hard to tell people in a free and open society how to work out their consumption patterns. But Charles Kennedy his last great service probably is to brought this into the public domain again.
David Davis.
Well, I also knew Charlie, and in fact we used to sort of share the lift up and down to our respective offices. And I actually think he didn't get as much credit as he deserved. I think actually it was Charles Kennedy more than anybody else who ironically created the grounds for the last coalition, even though he voted against it. He made the Liberal Democrat Party, at that point, big enough and strong enough to do that. Now, I'm trying to avoid repeating what Peter said about alcohol. Clearly, it's a scourge on some parts of society, but I'm at the end of the day, I'm a sort of classical liberal as well as being a Tory. I want people to have their own choices, make up their own mind, make their own decisions for good or bad. And actually, so would Charles Kennedy have taken exactly that view. So, sure, things like minimum pricing, frankly, more taxes on some aspects of more dangerous alcohol, I'm entirely in favour of. But at the end of the day, people's lives are their own to build and make.
Although, interestingly, Rishnara Ali, some recent research suggests that the proportion of teetotal young adults, so that's people aged 16 to 24, is actually going up. Yep. It's increased by 40% between 2005 and 2013. It suggests habits are changing anyway.
Yes, they are. I just want to say that as a new MP in the last Parliament, I had the great privilege of bumping into Charles Kennedy, and he was incredibly welcoming to those of us who came into Parliament, and he was among the few politicians that really did connect with the younger generation, because he was willing to go off and do television programmes that he often got criticised for, but it meant we actually saw him, and saw him not as a politician but as a human being. My thoughts are with him and his family. In terms of the lessons that we learn from what's happened, I think the fact that people are becoming teetotal, I'm teetotal myself, is about, it goes back to education. It goes back to, we are here in a school, it's with the family, it's about making sure young people know the risks, and we all have a responsibility in making sure that from a very young age we provide the support and guidance to young people about the dangers as well as the regulations that may or may not be needed. And I appreciate the tensions between giving people their liberties, but we do need to protect people from sliding into having a drinking problem.
Tommy Shepherd, you're new at the House of Commons. How is it for you?
Well, can I just say, first of all, about Charles Kennedy? I mean, I think a very bright light went out this week in British politics. He's a great loss to his party, to his country, and to politics generally, and will be sadly missed. I think, Scotland, as people have often joked, have probably more of a problem with alcohol abuse than the rest of the UK. And the Scottish Government, I'm glad to say, which has responsibility for this, is doing some things about it. We hope in the next year to double the budget available for NHS primary care intervention when they can identify a problem with someone coming through the health service, to try and offer counselling and to try and do something about it. Also, we are pursuing now in Europe the concept of minimum pricing, because I agree with the people that spoke earlier. I'm not for banning things or prohibition, but I do think there is a question about just how easy it has become to get access to alcohol now, and the fact that supermarkets are selling alcohol cheaper than water really sounds out something of the wrong signal. And minimum pricing and better licensing would be one way to do something about that, because one of the concerns, I think, is that as the licensed alcohol sector has become more and more policed and more and more red tape, so we have completely deregulated the off licenses in this country, and it's not a good thing. And one final point I'd just like to make is I do think you have to put this in a wider social context and ask, why is it that people succumb to this illness and drink themselves to distraction? What is wrong in our society? And I think there are deeper questions about the extinguishing of hope in our society, and the fact that so many people are living in such desperate circumstances that they try and find the answer in the bottle. And one of the things we have to do is make those social changes as well.
A similar point, actually. A similar point made actually by one of our followers tonight on Twitter, who says alcoholism is a mental health condition and very different from a culture of binge drinking, something that should be tackled, definitely, and separated, perhaps.
Well, one of the things, I should confess to the audience, I'm the only person with a glass of wine at dinner this evening amongst the panel. And one of the things I think is important, actually, is knowledge. You know, I mean, my wife constantly tells me how dangerous it is to drink more than 2 glasses an evening and so on. And I just think it's very important that people know what drink does to them from a very early age, because now we do know a lot about the impact of alcohol and how it has an impact from a very small quantity.
Well, if you want to have a say on any of this, you can, of course, phone Any Answers tomorrow. Anita Anand will be there. The number 03700 100 444, and the lines open at 12:30. And if you do want to tweet at us, do use the hashtag BBCAQ or follow us at BBC Any Questions. Our third question, please.
Robert Morrow, what, if anything, is beautiful about football?
Tommy Shepherd, is football beautiful?
It can be. I'm not a great football fan, but I like watching the international matches. And, of course, you'll know Scotland has led the way in boycotting the World Cup in recent years. We would very much hope to qualify sometime now. And I presume the question is about Sepp Blatter and FIFA and what is being going on there. And I just think it's shocking, really. And I'm not going to say it on live radio because I don't want to find myself in court, but it looks a little bit suspicious to me the way some of these decisions about who hosts the World Cup have been taken, and I would like to know if there was money exchanged for to buy favours in some of these decisions. I think also what's happening in Qatar as they prepare for the World Cup is absolutely shocking. We estimate over 1,000 people now killed in the construction of the stadia, and I think FIFA has got a responsibility not to be silent about that. I think FIFA has to ask itself if that is the respect that's given to human life in the construction of stadia for its greatest international celebration. Does it not have a moral responsibility to speak out about what's happening in Qatar?
Peter Hennessy.
If these allegations are true, it is truly depressing to think that the World Cup pitches have been seeded with bribes on the grand scale, if these allegations are true. And last Friday, Sepp Blatter was there. I remember looking at him, I watched that interview he gave, and it was mania. There's a sort of mania about it, a man who knew he was in trouble, but was becoming ever more assertive. Now, there's a man who's inhaled his own myth to a very high degree. He'd inhaled his own sense of impregnability. And it was like a medieval court. And when he'd finished that extraordinary press conference, people who depended upon his patronage from across the world came up to embrace him or to have a selfie taken with him. And this is a patronage society of a very old-fashioned kind that has no place in any regulatory body. And it's extraordinary to think that this huge multi-billion industry, it is the beautiful game, it's the most poetic game in many ways, and it's the game above all that's captured the imagination of the world in a way that cricket, which I also love, never has. I mean, Bernard Shaw was right. I mean, the English invented cricket to give the English people a sense of eternity. It just doesn't take in the way that football does. But seriously, I do wonder, and I'm not given to apocalyptic thinking normally, that if we might not have to start again with FIFA. If these allegations are true, it looks like it's so riddled with this right across the world that we might have to start again.
Well, what do you make of John Whittingdale's comment? I think, yes, on Thursday, he suggested that actually England or the UK should be ready to step forward and mount the World Cup.
Well, we're good at that, aren't we? Stepping in at the last minute. We're a 59th minute of the 11th hour nation. We always leave it virtually too late to do anything. But we have got wonderful stadiums, and the North East will do wonderfully well if we get the World Cup in 2022, so I'm all in favour of it, and not just because I'm sitting here in front of you this evening.
Rushnara Ali, is football still the beautiful game?
Well, look, football itself is a beautiful game, but these allegations and what's happened has brought disgrace. And what I worry about is the message it sends to football fans, and especially young people who are totally inspired by football, the message that the organisation responsible is corrupt, and that has to change. And that's why we need to make sure that the international community holds to account FIFA, and how that's done has to be constantly scrutinised. It is a beautiful game, but it won't be if it's dragged downwards because of these corruption allegations and, corruption of a scale that is utterly shocking. And I just think we've got to clean it up, and the international community has got to make sure that happens.
Robert Morrow, you asked the question. What do you think?
Well, I didn't really ask the question to relate to Sepp Blatter, but I thought it might get on the radio because it is current. But I think the amount of money that swishes around football is quite obscene these days, and that's probably one of the worst things about the game. And any beauty that it has can be at a local level where people played. I played a lot of football for a local team, and the atmosphere in the dressing room was always top class. But I am rather fed up with it on the television these days, and the same old thing every Saturday night.
David Davis.
Well, since I'm in confessional mood, I'll admit that it's not my game. I'm more Johnny Wilkinson than Wayne Rooney, until my favouritism. But of course it's a beautiful game. All athletic sports are beautiful, and it's the level of athleticism at the top of the sport is enormous. But I agree with you. Money is a corrupting factor in sport, not just in football, and in all sorts of ways, in subtle ways and much more vicious ways. And what rather disconcerted me was how easily Sepp Blatter got re-elected after the allegations were made in pretty plain terms. I mean, we're being very cautious here, but the allegations made by the American authorities were pretty plain. And that tells you, I'm afraid, that if these allegations are true, they're probably true on an incredibly widespread scale, which is the other thing to worry about. A lot of people, as it were, are accomplices. And there's been some attempt at apologia in some of the newspapers in the last week to say, well, of course, Sepp Blatter made sure that this small country had support for its football and so on. I'm afraid that's no excuse. And I'm with Peter. I would strike it out and start again.
But one other thing that has emerged from the discussions this week is the sort of massive difference of opinion that there is around the world about how FIFA has behaved, and clearly FIFA has given money to parts of the world that are very grateful for it, which has sort of set apart countries that you wouldn't necessarily have expected to be on different sides of the argument.
Well, that's what patronage does. If you build up a sort of client system around the world, it's very, very hard, then buttresses your position as the decades go by. And I forget how many times he's been reappointed to that job. I mean, he's hardly the youth policy anymore at the age of 79, is he? That's why when it crumbles very fast. And of course, I remember the days, and I'm very romantic about them, in the 50s, when people like the great Tom Finney got about 10 quid a week playing for Preston North End. If he played for England, he got 20, and ran a plumbing business. And I'm not suggesting we should go back to that, because the world has changed. But they were great figures in our lives when we were growing up, those of us of a certain age, but they were not celebritocracy as they are now. And that's another aspect of the game which I do think is very unfortunate. And I don't think it's particularly good for the young players either. But I'm being an old buffer this evening, as you can hear.
Right, shall we have our next question?
My name is David Pike. Of the candidates for new Labour Party leader, who do you think is the most suited for the role?
Rushnara Ali, you're standing for the deputy leadership. Who would you like to run with?
Well, I have said that as a candidate in the deputy leadership contest, I'm going to meet every one of the candidates. If I'm successful, then I look forward to working with the person that members and supporters elect. They've been great colleagues to me in the last 5 years that I've been a Member of Parliament. I want to see what they have to offer. I want members and supporters to see in this contest and hear the voices of the different candidates in both races.
But what do you think?
What do I think? Okay, well, what I will do is I will look at what they have to offer, and then I will decide. But I have said I will use my nomination powers, if necessary, to make sure that candidates who are close to getting in do have the opportunity to set out their stalls, so our members and supporters have a choice as well, and then I will decide with them. But at the moment, as a candidate, I have offered to work with any of the leadership candidates who win.
But left, right, Blairite, non-Blairite?
Yeah. Well, look. I think that
this is cruel and unusual punishment. It really is.
Look, I think that these left-right divisions are actually not relevant enough for
what
what
Jeremy
is a
Corbyn would say that if he was here
fragmented
tonight?
politics today. We lost in Scotland because we weren't left enough. We lost voters to UKIP. We lost 1 million ethnic minority voters to the Tory party. Middle-class voters didn't vote for us in the numbers that we needed them to. So our party has multiple challenges facing the left as well as right. So we need a response that's appropriate. And I think that this is a huge challenge for us. And business as usual is not going to work in our party. We need to change, but we need to go to voters who rejected us as well as those who supported us so that we can understand what happened, why we didn't win their trust, and rebuild by listening to people.
Okay.
41,000 more immigrants last year.
Okay, Rushnara Ali, hang on. You're not giving us a clear answer. You're keeping your powder dry. David Davis, as a man from the Conservative Party, who would you like to see leading the Labour Party?
Well, if I look at it from a Conservative point of view, Andy Burnham is one who's going to win. It suits me fine. But that probably won't help him too much. I'm a great believer that in democracy and in the importance of the House of Commons. And I think government is only as good as its opposition. If you have poor opposition, you have poor governments. So if I were taking that point of view, or indeed if I remember the Labour Party, I think I would go either for Liz Kendall or Mary Craig. So I think they need a new start. They need to rethink. They need not too much association with the past. One of the worst mistakes, I'm afraid, Ed Miliband made was appointing Ed Balls, which linked them to the past. Many couldn't escape it. So if I was making a point of view of Parliament, or from the point of view of the Labour Party, I'd go for one of the younger ones.
Tommy Shepherd, you had a long association with the Labour Party, and as I said in the introduction, you say the party left you rather than you leaving it. Looking at it with that, having had a foot in both camps, as it were, who would you like to see leading the party?
Well, in fairness, you know, when I worked for the Labour Party 20 years ago, they never took my advice then, so I don't think...
You can give it freely now, in that case.
I'm not sure they'll want it now, but I don't know. I mean, I do think, obviously, if you lose an election like that, you have to have a long look at yourself. But I think you can take introspection too far, to be honest. And it is a bit of concern. I've only been in the House of Commons a few weeks, but, I mean, the Labour benches do seem... they seem really wounded and as if in disarray to an extent that seems disproportionate to the election defeat they've just suffered. I mean, yeah, they lost the election and they didn't do very well, but if you leave Scotland to one side, it's not that impossible. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not meltdown. And
It
yet
was meltdown in Scotland.
Well, it was meltdown in Scotland, but in the rest of the United Kingdom, it doesn't seem to be that. I mean, I think they think it's worse than it actually was, to be honest. And there's a lot of there's soul searching. You can overwork this.
There you go, Rushnara. You're beating yourselves up far too much.
I do think you were talking about Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, I do think I think it would be good if he stood, and I think some of the people in the Labour Party that may not support him should nominate him, just to at least have a discussion and a contest. Because otherwise, it seems to me, it's really going to be a bit samey and people trying to choose from one candidate. But the final thing I'd say is that I think a lot of people in the Labour Party are very wary these days about overcommitting themselves to something for fear of what people will think about it. I think the lesson from Scotland is if you passionately believe in something and you articulate it clearly, then you can actually bring the electorate with you rather than having to follow them all the time. You can still win the battle of political ideas if you engage in it.
Rushnara.
Well, look, I agree that we need to make sure that we don't become an inward-looking party, that, clearly this loss has been devastating for my party. What we need to do is make sure that we don't just define ourselves against what we are, but we define ourselves for what we are, because our party is having a massive crisis of identity. And I know from my experience of fighting George Galloway in Bethnal Green and Bow and his party and winning, that we had to go back to the basic question to those who rejected us in 2005 and ask them where we went wrong. And that's how we're going to return back to... return to winning.
Can I pick up on
David?
And I just feel that we've got to start with understanding where the electorate came from. It's not about navel gazing. It's about going out into communities who rejected us.
There is a job of political parties to be leaders.
Yeah.
And Tom is exactly right.
Absolutely.
If you look at the standing or the ratings of both the Labour Party and SNP in Scotland in the run-up to the referendum, they were neck and neck. Literally, they're just changing places. And then 1 week after the referendum, the Scot Nats were at 48% and Labour was at 24%. Why? Because the Scot Nats had an ideal. They had a vision. I don't agree with it, but they had a vision and ideal. And I think if you exercise leadership and you say what you believe in, more people will vote for you than ever any other way.
With respect, David, your leader didn't honour his commitment. We did exercise leadership, but the day after the election, after the referendum, he didn't honour that commitment. He didn't act in the national interest. He acted in the interest of his party. Yeah, but you're talking about leadership and you're talking about acting in the national interest.
No, listen, I mean, you're not paying attention to the argument. The simple truth is that the Scottish Nationalist Party, I don't agree with a word of the Scottish Nationalist Party's manifesto, well, not many words of it, but the simple truth is they stood for something clear and simple and straightforward. And as a result, they galvanised a following in Scotland, which has not been seen for a very long time, over 50% of the vote, wasn't it? And that's the point. Vision in politics has a benefit far beyond the detail of the policy.
But I think the point that Rushnara is trying to make is that by having joined together in the Better Together campaign, was Labour then damaged by what happened the next day and all the discussion about English votes for English laws and so on?
If you talk to English Labour members, and I did during the course of the election campaign because I was wondering what was happening in Scotland, one of the things they said was the Scottish Labour Party brought this on themselves. They were machine politicians, they barely talked to their electorate, many places had not gone uncanvassed for a long time. It became sort of like a one-party state. It is now a one-party state the other way, of course, but it became like a one-party state, and that is corrosive. Too much unchallenged power, too much comfort is corrosive.
Peter Hennessy, I'm going to come to you for what I think is known as the long view.
Ah, that's very kind. I've been keeping very quiet because I'm a non-party member of the House of Lords and I wouldn't presume to tell any party who to choose. I do hope, because I'm fond of politicians in all parties actually, but I do hope, because I remember the 1980s witnessing the Labour Party from the outside, that dreadful civil war into which it collapsed, all its energies turned inward, and the malice per square foot was appalling. I do think you're going to escape it, Rushnara, this time, but I certainly hope that you don't go into even a miniature version of that civil war, because it'll do you no good. And David's point is very powerful about the system only works if you've got a very viable opposition. But we have moved, haven't we, from a 2 1/8 party system, the 1/8 being the Lib Dems, to a 2+4 party-lets. I think we're adapting to an entirely new political culture. Ken Clarke said this to me in a Radio 4 interview just before the election started, a very wise old bird, that the two major parties have got to adapt to us no longer being in the standard model, the standard post-war model. But I also think that both parties have got to have a rethink about what they really stand for, the major parties, because we've been very fortunate in this country in having our electoral competition since 1945 between two ideas. One is liberal capitalism, which I think is the best device yet created by man for innovation and growth, and the other is social democracy, which is the best device we've come up with so far for redistribution and all the rest of it. And British government has been about that. Whitehall has had to try and reconcile the two. Occasionally the electorate wants a really serious squirt of one rather than the other. But now we're in a slightly different world, and also the Prime Minister talks about blue-collar conservatism. I'm not sure what that means. My friend here is wearing a blue shirt, so he might tell me. And Labour's got to rethink, as Rushnara said, what is crucial for the Lib Dems have too, what the centre-left has got to bring to the table. So I wouldn't presume to say who they should pick, but I do hope that the Labour Party doesn't turn inwards and do unto itself what it did in the 1980s, from which it almost didn't recover.
I want to go back to the questioner, actually. Do you have, David Pike, a favoured choice for Labour leader?
I personally think Yvette Cooper, because I think she'd be a very competent leader and a very good one, very strong as well.
Rushnara Ali, there you go. There's a voice from the audience, the voters. Does that sway you?
Well, as I said, I think I'm going to keep my powder dry.
Just one last quick thought, though. David Davis, after 97, the Conservatives had a terrible time deciding what they were going to do, and I think you played your part in some of the elections and the changes of leadership that went on. It's not an easy thing to come back from.
No, although we had been literally almost decimated. We were down to 150 seats. I mean, a lot worse off than the Labour Party is. And it was, as well as that damage, there was also a massive loss of confidence, because the previous several years the party had been at war with itself in government. And so I don't think it's really comparable. I hope it's not comparable, because I do not want to see the end of the Labour Party. I think in politics, as in all else, justice demands two views.
Okay. Well, if you want to join in this conversation, do remember you can call Anita Anand tomorrow, 03700 100 444 for any answers. Tweet us, BBC AQ, that's the hashtag, or at BBC Any Questions. Our last question.
Anya Horn. Is it fair that MPs look set to be awarded a 10% pay rise, while frontline NHS staff have had only 1%?
Tommy Shepherd.
No, it's not. And I think there's two things that should be done. I don't think that the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority should have recommended that pay rise. They knew very well exactly the context in which they were operating and the restraints in the public sector, and they should have taken that into consideration, as well as other things about evaluating what a particular job's worth. I think if you're going to create that body, then you expect it to work in a political context.
So will you take the pay rise?
Sorry?
Will you take the pay rise?
But the second thing I want to say, because you were comparing it to the public sector increase, that's the other thing that needs to be changed. It is ridiculous that we continue to pay for what's happened in our economy and try to balance the books on the backs of some small sections of our society. Public sector workers, and indeed those who have the misfortune not to work at all, and disabled people in society. And the time has come to stop doing that, to start spending more on our public services, to create growth, get people back to work and into decent, well-paid jobs. So,
David Davis, this is a bit of a mess, isn't it? An independent body, and everybody suddenly says, we can't possibly take this pay rise.
Before the election, I opposed the proposed pay rise, because I thought it was particularly wrong in terms of assessment of what you should pay MPs. I just think now is a bad time, full stop. I mean, you take your point, Tommy, about what is an MP worth. You've got to find some sort of comparator. At the moment, MPs are paid less than headmasters, less than let's say a chief superintendent, not chief constable, chief superintendent, let alone, let's say, the chief executive of a local authority, paid half that. So it needs correction, but whether now is the time or that's the way, it's a different matter altogether.
Will you be taking the 10%?
You can't not. I mean, I tried before the election, just to give you an example of this, I tried before the election, I wanted to pay some more staff. And so I said, I haven't got enough budget for this, take it out my salary. You can't, Mr. Davis. They won't not do it.
Pete Hennessy.
I would give them the rise, because Parliament agreed that there should be this independent body to take it out of Parliament deciding its own pay and conditions, which was absolutely necessary. And I think they should do it. There's never a good time, David, is there? Never, ever is a good time to do it. I also think that the MPs I know are very honourable people for the most part, very hard-working. The public has a big down on them because there's laughter already in the hall, I may say that. But the expenses scandal has left an enormous scar. But it's tarnished a whole range of people who are absolutely impeccable. And they do an amazingly stretching and absolutely vital job. And also, they don't do themselves any good. I mean, because we see them every week at question time, behaving in a way which, if they were doing it in the streets of Walthamstow, where I live, or here, they'd be on the edge of an ASBO, wouldn't they? And yet, when they go upstairs a few hours later into a select committee, they do amazingly good forensic work. And the constituency workload of the good MP, the casework, is absolutely breathtaking. So I do think they're worth it. And if you set up an independent body, you should listen to that independent body and you should bite the bullet, because there never is such a good time. I know an argument like this is not going to... MPs who make it, or people like me who make it, are not going to be in receipt of the hosannas of a grateful and appreciative nation. But that's the way it is.
OK, unscientific poll. This is not a balanced audience. It's just the people that have chosen to be here this evening. But do you think that MPs in the hall should take a 10% pay rise? If you do, put your hand up. About a third of the hall, I'd say about 20 people. And who doesn't think they should take the pay rise? Most of the hall, yes. Interesting. Rushnara Ali.
Well, I'm going to donate the money that that is given to me. Each MP is making their own choice, and I'm going to donate that money to a charity I set up some years ago to help young people get into jobs, and that is something we need to do. And as part of my deputy leadership campaign, I want to see the Labour Party turn into a party of action so that we can help young people who are struggling, like in my constituency, and I know here as well, to find opportunities, find training and get jobs. And that's what I'm going to use it for.
But isn't it a bit mad that there is an independent body that was set up to set MPs' pay that suggests that this pay rise won't actually spend any more money because there have been cutbacks on expenses and pension contributions and so on, and yet MPs don't feel they can take the pay rise?
Well, for the reasons that have already been said, when public sector pay hasn't gone up very much at all, when my constituents are suffering and people up and down the country are suffering, it's impossible for us to justify the increase, even if it's applied to us independently. Okay. So it's put MPs in a very difficult position. But I also don't want to see a House of Commons full of people who are very wealthy because we create a culture where only rich people who say they're not going to earn any money by becoming an MP can get into Parliament. We have to be careful about that as well.
Anya Horn, you're a nurse, is that right? You asked the question.
Yeah. Sorry, it's not that I necessarily think that MPs don't deserve a pay rise, but we're all public sector workers. We all deserve a pay rise after years of very, very little.
Tommy Shepherd, do you want a brief last word?
Yeah, well, I just want to say I think the other thing that might endear us to the public respect is if we all agreed to do this as our only job. I've already know of a number of people in the House of Commons who have got second and third jobs, and I think that should be outlawed. If you're going to be an MP and represent people, you should give all your time to that, and it should be the only payroll that you're on.
Yes.
Something to pick up then with Anita Anand on Any Answers tomorrow, 03700 100 444. You can also text us on 84844. That's it for this evening. Thank you very much to our panel. That was Tommy Shepherd, Rushnara Ali, David Davis and Lord Hennessy. Thank you also to Marden High School for having us. Next week, we're at the St John's Church. Jonathan will be at the St John's Church in Waterloo. Diane Abbott, London mayoral candidate, will be on the panel.